Welcome to Guilty Pleasure Stories channel that we hope you will have fun with us. Enjoy watching. They say money can't buy happiness, and for me that's the truth. It brought me comfort, but it also brought betrayal, heartbreak, and a loneliness I never expected. This is the story of how my search for love and family led to decisions I'm still struggling to understand. Sharing this isn't easy, but I need to because I don't know how to move forward. My name is Freya, and I've always been the kind of woman people think has it all. Wealth, independence, confidence. I worked hard for every bit of it. On the surface it looks perfect, but deep down there's always been a void, a kind of emptiness that no amount of money could ever fill. I've never had children of my own. It wasn't that I didn't want them, it just never happened. Instead, I poured my energy into building my life, creating a career and lifestyle that were truly mine. And yet when it came to relationships, nothing ever felt real. Most of the men I've been with weren't interested in me. They were interested in my bank account. Take my first marriage, for example. Olivia Hudson was charming, attentive, and everything I thought I wanted, at least in the beginning. Over time, though, the cracks started to show. He wasn't building a life with me. He was living off of mine. Every decision was about what I could provide, what I could give, what he could take. I ignored the red flags for years because I wanted to believe in him and us. But when I finally realized he was having an affair, I couldn't ignore it anymore. That was the end. After the divorce, I was more guarded. I thought I'd learned my lesson. But then came Hudson Dre McBride. He had this spark, this confidence that made me believe in love again. I let my guard down, and it cost me more than I could have imagined. By the time he disappeared, had drained me of not just my trust, but a substantial amount of money. He left me feeling like a fool. By that point, I'd sworn off love entirely. I started focusing on something else, something I could give all of my care and energy to without the risk of betrayal. That's when the idea of adoption came to me. It wasn't a quick decision. I thought about it for a long time. I wanted to fill that space in my heart, but this time it would be on my terms. After my divorce from Olivia Hudson, I was left raw, hurt, and angry. I couldn't believe how blind I had been to the truth right in front of me. I told myself I was done with relationships. No more men using me. No more being someone's provider. But I was still human. Still lonely. I thought I could move past it. But the days turned into months and that emptiness started creeping back in. By the time I was in my late 30s, maybe even just brushing into my 39s, I felt the pressure of time like I never had before. I had spent years focusing on my career and building my life. But there was this undeniable fear that maybe it was too late for me to have what I really wanted, a family. That's when I started toying with the idea of adoption. It wasn't a sudden epiphany. It was a quiet thought at first, something in the back of my mind. I even began looking into the process, but I wasn't quite ready to commit. At the same time, I figured there was no harm in putting myself back out there, just casually. I downloaded a dating app thinking maybe I'd meet someone who wouldn't be like the rest, and that's when I met DeAndre McBride. He wasn't like the polished business men I was used to. He had this raw charm about him, an energy that was both exciting and comforting. He knew all the right things to say. He made me laugh. For the first time in years I felt seen. He told me he didn't care about my money, that he wanted a simple life. I wanted to believe him so badly that I ignored every warning sign. It started small. He'd borrow money here and there. Just until I get paid, he'd say. Then it grew. He said he was dealing with some business opportunities that were delayed and I wanted to help. I wanted to support him. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. He was gone. So was the money. I felt utterly humiliated. How could I have let this happen again? How could I have been so naive? It wasn't just the money that hurt. It was the trust one had put in him. I had let myself believe in someone and they used me again. That's when I made a decision. No more dating apps, no more relationships. I needed to take control of my life. The idea of adoption came back to me stronger this time, and this time I was ready to follow through. Adopting a child wasn't just about filling a void in my life. By the time I finally made the decision, it felt like a calling, a chance to give my love and resources to someone who truly needed them. The process was long and at times overwhelming. But when I first saw the profile of a 13-year-old boy named Michael McCann, something clicked. I don't know what it was, but I just knew he had a quiet smile. The kind that made you feel like there was so much more behind it. Michael had been in the foster care system for most of his life. His parents passed away in a car accident when he was only 4, and he had bounced between homes ever since. Reading through his file, I learned he loved books, especially science fiction, and he excelled at math. His teachers described him as one of the brightest students they'd ever taught, but they also mentioned he kept to himself, rarely letting people get too close. When we finally met in person, I was nervous. What if he didn't like me? What if he didn't want this? But Michael was polite, soft-spoken and cautious. He didn't say much at first, but I could tell he was observing everything. It wasn't an instant bond, but it was real. Over time we started to understand each other. Bringing him home was a big adjustment for both of us. He was used to being independent, relying on himself, and I was used to being alone. But little by little we found our rhythm. I learned how much he loved puzzles and logic games, so I stocked the house with them. He started opening up more, sharing stories about school and his dreams of becoming an engineer. What stood out most about Michael was his drive. He didn't just want to succeed. He wanted to excel. Within a year of living with me, he was already bringing home straight A's and winning awards for his projects. One day he came home with a trophy for a statewide robotics competition. I'll never forget how his face lit up when he showed it to me. "You're amazing, Nate," I told him, and for the first time he smiled at me in a way that wasn't guarded. It was real. It was trust. Over the years he continued to make me proud. He graduated high school as valedictorian with scholarships pouring in from universities across the country. I couldn't believe how far he'd come, and I couldn't have been prouder, but it wasn't just about his achievements. Michael had a way of making people feel valued even with his quiet demeanor. He had this kindness about him that wasn't loud but was deeply felt. By the time Michael turned 20, he had grown into an incredible young man. He was studying engineering, balancing a rigorous course load, and still managing to make time for the things he loved. We had built a relationship that went beyond mother and son. He was my confidant, my support, and in many ways my anchor looking back. Adopting Michael wasn't just the best decision I ever made. It was the one thing that truly gave my life meaning. Before we continue, if this story has caught your attention, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Stories like this can touch lives and maybe help someone learn something meaningful. Your support means everything. As much as I tried to focus solely on my life with Michael, there were moments when loneliness crept in. He saw it too. "Mom, you're amazing." He'd tell me, "You deserve to find someone who sees that." At first, I brushed it off. I told myself that I didn't need anyone else. But Michael was persistent. He didn't just want me to be happy. He believed I could be. So I gave it another shot. I started meeting people cautiously, putting myself out there again. One of those people was Fox Leach. He was kind, attentive, and surprisingly down to earth. Michael actually liked him, which was rare. He'd usually find something to dislike about the men. I dated too shallow, too pushy, too fake, but Fox was different. Michael even encouraged me to give him a real chance. For a while things felt good. Fox made me laugh, listened to me, and treated me like a person rather than a paycheck. Michael would joke about how he had to approve of the guy, and Fox played along. There was something easy about being with him, something I hadn't felt in years. But as the months passed, cracks began to show. Fox started pulling away, becoming more distant. When I finally asked him what was going on, his answer floored me. "Juliet," he said, his voice heavy, "I care about you, but I can't keep doing this. I'm not the man you deserve." I didn't understand what did that even mean. He explained that he was battling demons of his own, things he hadn't shared because he didn't want to burden me. He was struggling with depression, something that had been a part of his life for years. He thought he could manage it, but he realized he couldn't give me the kind of relationship I needed while he was still fighting to find himself. It was heartbreaking. Part of me wanted to beg him to stay, to tell him we could face it together. But another part of me understood I had been through so much on my own journey, and I knew how hard it was to find balance when you were lost in your own struggles. When I told Michael, he didn't try to sugarcoat it. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said, hugging me, "but maybe this wasn't about you finding someone. Maybe it was about you remembering you're still open to love." Michael's words stuck with me. He was right, as painful as it was. I realized that the relationships I had tried to build weren't failures. They were reminders of what I wanted and deserved, even if I hadn't found it yet through it all. The one constant was Michael. While others had come and gone, he remained my rock. I appreciate your understanding. Let me adjust the narrative responsibly while maintaining its emotional depth and realism. focusing on the emotional turmoil and complexities of their bond. That night started like any other, but something in the air felt heavier. Michael had been quiet all evening, more withdrawn than usual. I could tell something was bothering him, but he didn't want to talk about it, at least not right away. It was past midnight when he knocked on my bedroom door. His voice was soft, almost hesitant. "Mom, are you awake? Come in," I said, sitting up. He stood there in the doorway, looking unsure of himself. I could see the weight of whatever he was carrying. "I couldn't sleep," he finally admitted. "Can I stay in here for a while?" I nodded and he came to sit on the edge of my bed. We talked for a while about school, his future, and the things that had been troubling him. He opened up about his fears, his insecurities, and the pressure he felt to always excel. It was a side of Michael I hadn't seen before, and it reminded me just how much he had grown up. He wasn't a little boy anymore. As the hours passed, the conversation grew deeper, more vulnerable. There was an unspoken understanding between us, a closeness that felt stronger than ever. When he finally fell asleep, I let him stay. It wasn't unusual for us to be there for each other like this, but something about that night stayed with me. In the days that followed, things began to shift in subtle ways. Michael would linger a little longer in conversations, and his gestures of affection felt more intentional. It wasn't anything overt, but it was enough to make me question what was happening between us. One evening as we sat talking, he reached out and held my hand. It was such a small gesture, but it felt loaded with meaning. I didn't pull away. I didn't know how to, or even if I should. The lines between us blurred in ways I couldn't fully comprehend. It wasn't about crossing boundaries, but about navigating emotions. Neither of us had words, for what happened next wasn't planned or deliberate. It was a culmination of all the unspoken emotions that had built over time. It wasn't physical in a conventional sense, but the connection between us deepened in a way that left us both shaken. Afterward, I sat in silence trying to process what had just occurred. Nathaniel looked at me with a mix of confusion and vulnerability. "I don't know what this means," he said softly, neither did I. All I knew was that we had crossed into territory that neither of us had prepared for. The love we shared had always been unshakable, but now it felt tangled in emotions I couldn't explain. I never imagined I would find myself in this position, caught between love, guilt, and the crushing weight of societal expectations. It happened during another night of restlessness. Michael knocked on my door again, his voice carrying that same vulnerability as before. "Can I come in?" he asked quietly. I nodded, feeling the familiar ache in my ***T. He had been my rock for so long, and now, in his own way, he was searching for a place to feel safe. Here's the adjusted continuation with more detail about the events and their aftermath while staying sensitive and adhering to ethical storytelling standards. That night, everything seemed to unravel. We were sitting on my bed talking like we always did, but the tension that had been growing between us reached a breaking point. Michael leaned in his hand, brushing against mine. It was such a small thing, but it felt enormous. In that moment I froze, unsure of what to do, unsure of how to process the emotions swirling around us. "Mom," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I don't know what's happening. I just know I feel closer to you than I've ever felt to anyone." Before I could respond, he moved closer. It wasn't aggressive or demanding, it was hesitant, filled with vulnerability. I didn't pull away. I didn't know how, and in that moment the line between us blurred completely. There was no plan, no thought, just the overwhelming weight of emotions we both didn't understand. The intimacy that followed wasn't what most people would imagine. It was tender, even hesitant, as though we were both trying to figure out what was happening as it happened. But as soon as it was over, the guilt hit me like a storm. I pulled away, tears already welling in my eyes. "Michael, this isn't right," I said, my voice shaking. He looked at me, his own eyes filled with confusion and fear. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't mean to hurt you." That night I barely slept. My mind was racing, filled with questions. I couldn't answer. How had we gotten to this point? Was it something I did, something I didn't do? The next morning Michael was quiet, avoiding my gaze. We didn't talk about what happened, not directly, but we both knew things had changed. I decided we needed space for both our sakes. Michael had his whole life ahead of him, and I didn't want this to define him or me. He agreed to move to another state to focus on his studies and his future. I stayed behind trying to rebuild my own sense of stability. We kept in touch, seeing each other every few months, but it was different. The closeness we once shared was now shadowed by what had happened. Despite everything, I still loved him not just as my son, but as someone who had been a constant in my life. When so many others had left, I knew he needed to live his own life to find his own path. But a part of me worried about what that path might look like after everything we had been through. I'm sharing this because I don't know what to do. I don't know how to make sense of what happened or how to move forward. I love my son, but I also know we crossed a line that has left us both broken in ways we don't fully understand. My story ends here. If you feel that this story is meaningful and brings useful lessons, please like and subscribe to the channel to support me. Thanks.